The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered wooden planks of Dust Hollow's main street, painting the frontier town in hues of amber and gold. Clara-May Henderson bent over her sewing machine in the cramped back room of Morrison's general store, her calloused fingers guiding delicate fabric through precise stitches. At 23, her hands told the story of countless hours spent mending the clothes of townsfolk who barely acknowledged her existence. "Clara-May," bellowed Mr. Morrison from the front of the store. "Mrs. Carrington's here for her dress alterations." Clara-May set down the blue gingham she'd been hemming and smoothed her own simple brown dress. Through the thin wall, she could hear the unmistakable voice of Elizabeth Carrington, wife of the town's wealthiest cattle baron, discussing the upcoming annual land auction with Morrison. "I do hope someone suitable bids on the old Henderson property this year," Mrs. Carrington was saying, her tone dripping with false concern. "It's such an eyesore sitting there unused. Charles says it's prime grazing land, wasted on sentiment." Clara-May's hands trembled as she picked up the altered burgundy dress. The Henderson property, her family's land, the place where she'd been born, where her parents had built their dreams before the fever took them when she was 12. The place that legally should have been hers, if not for the unfortunate loss of her father's will and the quick action of certain town officials to claim it for unpaid taxes. "Good morning, Mrs. Carrington," Clara-May said softly as she emerged from the back room, holding the dress carefully. Elizabeth Carrington looked her up and down with barely concealed disdain. "Oh, the seamstress. I do hope you've managed to get the hem right this time. Charles is very particular about my appearance at social functions." "I believe you'll find it to your satisfaction, ma'am." Clara-May handed over the dress, watching as Mrs. Carrington held it up to the light, searching for flaws. It will have to do, I suppose." She turned back to Morrison. "As I was saying, the auction tomorrow should finally settle the matter of all those unclaimed properties. It's been 11 years since the Henderson incident. High time the land went to someone who can make proper use of it." Clara-May's jaw clenched. The Henderson incident, as if her parents' death from typhoid was merely an inconvenience to be swept away. As if the mysterious disappearance of all their legal documents was just an unfortunate coincidence. "Will that be all, Mrs. Carrington?" Clara-May managed to keep her voice steady. "Yes, I believe so." Elizabeth dropped coins onto the counter without looking at her. "Though I do hope you'll find something more appropriate to wear to the auction tomorrow. The whole town will be there, and we wouldn't want to give visitors the wrong impression of Dust Hollow's standards." After Mrs. Carrington swept out in a rustle of silk and superiority, Morrison shook his head. "Don't mind her, Clara-May. She's been wound tighter than a watch spring ever since she heard about those railroad surveyors coming through next month." "Railroad surveyors?" Clara-May's pulse quickened. "Didn't you hear? The Colorado and Southern is looking to extend their line through this area. Whoever owns the Henderson property stands to make a fortune when they come through wanting to buy land for the depot and rail yards." Morrison counted the coins Mrs. Carrington had left. "Charles Carrington's been real interested in that land lately. Real interested." Clara-May felt a familiar fire kindle in her chest. The same fire that had kept her going through 11 years of whispered rumors, suspicious glances, and barely concealed hostility from the town's elite. They'd taken everything from her. Her home, her inheritance, her rightful place in society. And now they were about to profit handsomely from their theft. She spent the rest of the day working mechanically, her mind racing. That evening, as she climbed the narrow stairs to her tiny room above the store, she pulled out a worn leather satchel from beneath her bed. Inside, carefully preserved, were documents she'd managed to save from the fire that had mysteriously consumed the courthouse records room 3 days after her parents' funeral. Her father's handwriting stared back at her from a partially burned deed. "Hereby grant and convey to my beloved daughter, Clara-May Henderson, all rights, title, and interest in the following described property." The rest was charred beyond reading, but it was enough. Combined with her birth certificate, her parents' marriage license, and a letter from the bank acknowledging her father's full payment of the property taxes through 1885, it painted a clear picture of fraud and corruption. For 11 years, she'd been afraid to speak up. A young girl, then a young woman, alone against the most powerful families in town. But tomorrow, with the whole community gathered and witnesses present, she would finally tell her story. Thunder rumbled in the distance as Clara-May carefully returned the documents to their hiding place. The autumn air carried the scent of rain and change. Tomorrow, everything would change. She'd spent years perfecting her sewing skills, observing the intricacies of human nature through the customers who came and went. She'd learned to read people like fabric patterns, their weaknesses, their tells, their carefully hidden truths. The town's elite had grown comfortable in their conspiracy of silence, but Clara-May had been watching, listening, and preparing. Tomorrow, at the auction, she would do more than bid on her family's land. She would reclaim her rightful place in Dust Hollow, and those who had wronged her would finally face the consequences of their actions. The first drops of rain began to fall against her window as Clara-May finally drifted off to sleep, her dreams filled with the sound of her own voice, strong and clear, speaking truth to power. The morning of the auction dawned grey and oppressive, with heavy clouds hanging low over Dust Hollow like a wool blanket. Clara-May woke before sunrise, her stomach churning with nervous energy. She dressed carefully in her best dress, a simple navy blue creation she'd sewn herself, modest but well-tailored. In the mirror, she practiced the words she'd rehearsed 1,000 times in her mind. By 8 o'clock, Main Street was already bustling with activity. Wagons rolled in from surrounding ranches, and the morning train had brought several well-dressed strangers, potential investors drawn by rumors of the railroad expansion. Clara-May watched from Morrison's window as workers erected a platform in front of the courthouse, complete with bunting and a podium for auctioneer Jenkins. "Big day today," Morrison said, joining her at the window. "Biggest auction we've had in years. That Henderson property alone is expected to go for more than most folks see in a lifetime." "Mr. Morrison," Clara-May said quietly, "I need to ask a favor." He turned to look at her, noting the unusual tension in her voice. "What is it, child?" "I need the afternoon off. There's something I have to do at the auction." Morrison's weathered face creased with concern. "Clara-May, you're not thinking of trying to bid on that land, are you? I know it meant something to your family, but the starting bid alone is more than—" "I'm not planning to bid," she interrupted, "but I do need to be there." Something in her tone made Morrison study her more carefully. In the 3 years she'd worked for him, Clara-May had been nothing but quiet, reliable, and deferential. But today there was steel in her voice that he'd never heard before. "Of course," he said finally. "Take all the time you need." By noon, the crowd had swelled to include nearly every resident of Dust Hollow and the surrounding area. Clara-May made her way through the press of people, her leather satchel clutched tightly against her side. She could feel the documents inside, their edges worn smooth by years of handling, their words holding the power to shatter the comfortable lies that had governed this town for over a decade. Near the platform, she spotted the familiar figures of the town's power brokers. Charles Carrington stood with Mayor Whitmore and Judge Ashford, their heads bent together in earnest conversation. Their wives clustered nearby, resplendent in their finest dresses, clearly enjoying their position as Dust Hollow's self-appointed social elite. "Ladies and gentlemen," auctioneer Jenkins climbed onto the platform, his voice carrying across the crowd. "Welcome to Dust Hollow's annual land auction. We have some fine properties available today, including several prime pieces that are sure to appreciate significantly with the coming railroad expansion." The crowd murmured with excitement. Clara-May positioned herself near the edge of the gathering, close enough to be seen, but far enough back to avoid immediate attention. "Our first item today is the Morrison Creek pasture land, 40 acres of prime grazing, starting bid $50. The bidding was brisk. with several ranchers competing before the land went to a newcomer from Denver for $85. Clara-May barely paid attention, her focus entirely on the approaching moment when the Henderson property would be called. "Now then," Jenkins announced after 3 more sales, "we come to one of our most significant offerings today. The Henderson property, 160 acres of prime land with creek access, timber rights, and a strategic location for future development. Starting bid, $200. Charles Carrington immediately raised his hand. "200. $250, called a voice from the back, one of the railroad representatives. "300, Carrington countered, his jaw set with determination. Clara-May watched the bidding escalate, her heart pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. $400, $500, $600, more money than she'd see in 5 years of sowing. $700! Carrington's voice had an edge of desperation now. $750! The railroad man seemed unperturbed by the climbing price. Jenkins looked around the crowd. $750. Do I hear 800? 800 for this prime piece of Dust Hollow real estate? This was it. Clara-May stepped forward, her voice cutting through the autumn air like a blade. "I object to this sale." The crowd fell silent. Jenkins blinked in confusion, his gavel frozen halfway to the wooden block. All eyes turned to the young seamstress who had dared to interrupt the proceedings. "I beg your pardon, miss," Jenkins stammered. Clara-May's legs felt like water, but she forced herself to walk forward into the center of the crowd's attention. "I said I object to this sale. This land cannot legally be auctioned because it doesn't belong to the town." A ripple of shocked murmurs ran through the gathering. Charles Carrington's face had gone pale, while Judge Ashford was pushing through the crowd toward the platform. "Young lady," Jenkins said with forced patience, "this is highly irregular. The town has clear title to this property, purchased for unpaid taxes in 1878. Now, if you'll please—" "The town has no such title," Clara-May interrupted, her voice growing stronger with each word, "because the taxes were never unpaid, and the property was never legally abandoned." More murmurs, louder now. She could see the shock and confusion on faces throughout the crowd, but also something else, curiosity. For the first time in 11 years, someone was challenging the official story. Judge Ashford had reached the platform. "This is preposterous. Young woman, I don't know what you think you're doing, but—" "I know exactly what I'm doing, Your Honor." Clara-May's voice carried clearly across the crowd. "I'm exposing a fraud that has gone on for 11 years, and I have the documents to prove it." She raised the leather satchel, and for a moment, time seemed suspended. The grey clouds overhead rumbled ominously, and the first fat drops of rain began to fall, but nobody moved. Every eye was fixed on the young seamstress who had just accused the town's most powerful men of fraud. Charles Carrington found his voice first. "This is ridiculous. The girl is clearly unstable. Perhaps we should let her speak." The voice came from the back of the crowd, and Clara-May felt a surge of gratitude as she recognized Thomas Mackenzie, the newspaper editor who had always treated her with kindness. He pushed forward, his notebook already in hand. "Go ahead, Miss Henderson," he said, deliberately using her family name. "Tell us what you have to say." Clara-May took a deep breath. The rain was falling steadier now, but no one in the crowd had moved. This was the moment she had been preparing for 11 long years. "My name is Clara-May Henderson," she began, her voice carrying across the silent crowd. "And that land you're trying to auction? It's mine." The silence that followed Clara-May's declaration was broken only by the increasing patter of rain on the courthouse roof and the distant rumble of thunder. Every face in the crowd was turned toward her, expressions ranging from shock to skepticism to barely concealed alarm from certain members of the town's elite. "That's impossible," Judge Ashford sputtered, his usually composed demeanor cracking. "The Henderson family died out years ago. Everyone knows that." "Not everyone," Clara-May replied steadily. "The Henderson family didn't die out, Your Honor. The Henderson daughter survived. I survived." A wave of whispers swept through the crowd. Clara-May could see the recognition dawning on some of the older faces, people who had known her parents, who had perhaps suspected the truth, but never dared to voice it. "Even if that were true," Charles Carrington interjected, stepping closer to the platform, "which I highly doubt, it wouldn't matter. The property was legally seized for unpaid taxes. The girl was just a child, with no legal guardian to maintain the estate." "Actually, Mr. Carrington," Clara-May opened her satchel with steady hands, "that's not quite accurate." She withdrew a folded document, its edges brown with age. "This is a receipt from the First Bank of Dust Hollow, dated March 15th, 1878, 3 days before my parents died. It shows payment in full for all property taxes through December 1885. Thomas Mackenzie had moved closer, his pencil flying across his notebook. "May I see that document, Miss Henderson?" Clara-May handed it over, watching as the editor examined it carefully. His eyebrows rose as he read. "This appears to be genuine," he announced to the crowd. "Signed and stamped by Bank President Harold Morrison. That would be your father, wouldn't it, Frank?" All eyes turned to Morrison, who stood near the front of the crowd, looking increasingly uncomfortable. "Well, that is to say, it was a long time ago, and my father's records from that period were destroyed in the courthouse fire," Judge Ashford finished quickly. "Along with all the other relevant documents. Without corroborating records, one piece of paper proves nothing." Clara-May felt a cold smile cross her lips. "You're absolutely right, Your Honor. One piece of paper proves nothing." She reached into her satchel again. "But I have more than one piece of paper." The next document she produced was her parents' marriage certificate, followed by her own birth certificate, then a partial deed showing her father's original purchase of the land. Each document passed through Thomas Mackenzie's hands before being held up for the crowd to see. "Furthermore," Clara-May continued, her confidence growing as she watched the increasing discomfort of her opponents, "I have witnesses who were present when my father paid those taxes. Mrs. Elena Rodriguez, who was working as a teller at the bank, Samuel Brooks, who was standing in line behind my father, and Reverend Matthews, who was there to make a donation to the church building fund." She looked directly at the 3 individuals as she named them, all of whom were present in the crowd. Mrs. Rodriguez, now in her 60s, slowly raised her hand. "It's true," she called out, her heavily accented voice carrying clearly. "I remember that day. Mr. Henderson was so proud, saying he wanted to make sure his little girl would always have a home, no matter what happened to him and his wife." Samuel Brooks, a weathered rancher, nodded grimly. "I was there too. Heard him tell the bank clerk that he wanted a receipt, something he could keep in his family Bible to prove the taxes were paid." Reverend Matthews, an elderly man with kind eyes, stepped forward. "I remember James Henderson as a good man, devoted to his family. If he said he paid those taxes, then he paid them. The man never told a lie in his life." The murmurs in the crowd were growing louder now, and Clara-May could see the tide of public opinion beginning to shift. But she wasn't finished yet. "There's something else," she said, producing a small leather-bound book from her satchel, "my father's Bible, which I managed to save from our house before it was cleared out after the funeral." She opened the Bible to a page marked with a faded ribbon. Inside the front cover, my father wrote a complete list of all his financial obligations and their payment dates, including this entry: property taxes paid in full through 1885, receipt kept in deed box. The deed box that was supposedly destroyed in the courthouse fire, Thomas Mackenzie said, his reporter's instincts clearly engaged. The same fire that happened just 3 days after the Henderson funeral. Judge Ashford's face was growing red. "Are you implying that the courthouse fire was deliberately set?" "That's a serious accusation, Mr. Mackenzie." "I'm not implying anything, Your Honor. I'm simply noting the remarkable timing." Clara-May looked out over the crowd, seeing a mix of sympathy, outrage, and calculation on the faces before her. The rain was falling steadier now, but no one had left. If anything, more people were pressing forward, drawn by the unfolding drama. "For 11 years," she said, her voice carrying over the sound of the rain, "I've watched this town treat me like an orphan charity case. I've worked for scraps, lived in a tiny room, and listened to people talk about my family's land like it was theirs to give away. I've heard the whispers, the suggestions that maybe my parents deserved what happened to them, that maybe they were irresponsible with their finances." Her voice grew stronger, more passionate. But they weren't irresponsible. They were careful, hard-working people who saved every penny to buy that land and build a future for their daughter. And when they died, certain people in this town saw an opportunity to steal what they had worked so hard to build. "That's a very serious accusation, young lady." Mayor Whitmore had finally found his voice. "Do you have proof of this alleged conspiracy?" Clara-May looked directly at him, then at Judge Ashford, then at Charles Carrington. "I'm working on it, Mr. Mayor, but I think the evidence is starting to speak for itself." Lightning flashed across the sky, followed by a crack of thunder that seemed to punctuate her words. The crowd was becoming restless, people looking at each other with new questions in their eyes. Thomas Mackenzie stepped onto the platform beside her. "I think Miss Henderson has raised some very serious questions about the legitimacy of this auction. Perhaps we should postpone the sale until these matters can be properly investigated." "Absolutely not!" Charles Carrington's composure finally cracked completely. "This is nothing but the desperate fantasy of a disturbed young woman who can't accept her circumstances. We can't allow every auction to be disrupted by wild accusations and forged documents." "Forged documents?" Clara-May's eyes flashed with anger. "Mr. Carrington, are you accusing me of forgery?" "I'm saying that anyone could have created these papers after the fact. Where have they been for 11 years? Why bring them forward now?" Clara-May smiled coldly. "They've been exactly where they belong, Mr. Carrington, in my possession, waiting for the right moment to bring them to light. And as for why now..." She looked around the crowd, her gaze settling on the well-dressed strangers from the railroad. "I think we both know why now." The railroad representatives were watching the proceedings with keen interest, clearly recognizing that any uncertainty about the land's ownership would complicate their plans. One of them, a distinguished man in an expensive suit, stepped forward. "Perhaps," he said in a cultivated Eastern accent, "it would be wise to resolve these questions before any sales take place. The Colorado and Southern Railway has no interest in purchasing land with disputed titles." Charles Carrington's face went white at these words. Clara-May could see the fear in his eyes now. The fear of losing what he had been so certain was within his grasp. "There's no dispute," he protested desperately. "The town has clear title." Actually," Thomas Mackenzie said, closing his notebook with a snap, "I think Miss Henderson has demonstrated that the town's title is anything but clear. In fact, I believe she's made a compelling case that she is the rightful owner of the Henderson property." The crowd erupted in discussion, voices rising over the sound of the rain. Clara-May stood at the center of it all, no longer the timid seamstress who had hidden in the back room of Morrison's store. For the first time in 11 years, she felt like Clara-May Henderson, daughter of James and Martha Henderson, rightful heir to one of the finest pieces of land in the territory. But she knew her battle was far from over. The documents she had shown were just the beginning. The real fight would come when the full truth emerged about what had really happened in those chaotic days following her parents' death. The crowd had taken shelter under the courthouse eaves and the awnings of nearby buildings, but no one had left. The tension in the air was as thick as the storm clouds overhead. Clara-May stood on the platform, rain droplets glistening on her hair, facing the most powerful men in Dust Hollow with a steadiness that surprised even herself. Judge Ashford was conferring urgently with Mayor Whitmore and Charles Carrington, their voices low, but their agitation evident. Clara-May watched them with the same careful attention she'd learned to apply to difficult stitching, looking for the places where the pattern didn't quite align, where the fabric might tear under pressure. "Miss Henderson," Judge Ashford finally addressed her, attempting to regain control of the situation. "While your documents are interesting, I'm afraid they don't change the fundamental facts. Your parents died intestate, you were a minor with no legal guardian, and the property was legally claimed by the town for unpaid taxes." "Actually, Your Honor," Clara-May's voice carried a note of steel, "my parents didn't die intestate, they had a will." The effect of her words was immediate. Charles Carrington went rigid, Mayor Whitmore's face drained of colour, and Judge Ashford's carefully composed mask slipped entirely. "That's impossible," the judge stammered. "No will was ever filed with the court." "No," Clara-May agreed. "It wasn't, but that doesn't mean it didn't exist." She reached into her satchel one more time, withdrawing a document that made several people in the crowd gasp audibly. It was charred around the edges, water-stained and partially illegible, but the legal formatting was unmistakable. "This is a copy of my parents' last will and testament, drawn up by attorney Franklin Pierce just 2 months before they died. The original was kept in the courthouse vault, but I managed to save this copy from the fire that destroyed our house." Thomas Mackenzie stepped forward eagerly. "May I examine it?" Clara-May handed over the document, watching as the editor studied it carefully. His face grew grave as he read. "This will explicitly leaves all property and assets to Clara-May Henderson," he announced to the crowd. "It also names a legal guardian for the minor child, one Samuel Henderson, James Henderson's brother, from Colorado Springs." A ripple of shock ran through the gathering. Clara-May continued, her voice growing stronger with each revelation. "Uncle Samuel traveled here immediately upon receiving word of my parents' death. He arrived on April 3rd, 1878. I remember because it was a Sunday, and he came straight to the church where I was staying with Reverend Matthew's family." She looked directly at Judge Ashford. "Uncle Samuel went to the courthouse that Monday morning to file the will and establish his guardianship. He met with you, Your Honor, and with Mayor Whitmore. He had all the proper documents, all the legal requirements." "I don't recall any such meeting," Judge Ashford said stiffly, but sweat was visible on his brow despite the cool air. "Perhaps this will refresh your memory." Clara-May produced a small envelope from her satchel. A letter from Uncle Samuel to his wife, describing his frustration with the, quote, "inexplicable delays and bureaucratic obstacles he encountered in Dust Hollow." She began to read aloud. "Dearest Margaret, I arrived safely, but am dismayed by the treatment I've received from the local officials. Judge Ashford claims there are irregularities with James's will, though he cannot specify what they are. Mayor Whitmore insists there are unpaid debts that must be settled before any estate can be probated, though no creditors have come forward. Most disturbing of all, several townspeople have approached me with offers to buy the property at far below its actual value, suggesting it would save me the trouble of dealing with the local courts." The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word. Clara-May continued reading. "I suspect there is some scheme afoot to acquire James's land through questionable means. The property is far more valuable than these people want me to believe, and I fear they view a grieving child and her uncle from out of territory as easy marks. I've decided to return home to gather additional legal documents and perhaps bring an attorney with me when I return." Clara-May looked up from the letter. Uncle Samuel never made it back to Dust Hollow. His stage was attacked by bandits on the return journey to Colorado Springs. He and 3 other passengers were killed. Mrs. Rodriguez crossed herself. "Madre mia," she whispered. "The attack happened on April 15th, 1878, Clara-May continued, 2 weeks after he left Dust Hollow, and 3 days before the courthouse fire that destroyed all record of his visit and my parents' will." Thomas Mackenzie was writing furiously in his notebook. "That's an extraordinary series of coincidences, Miss Henderson." "I thought so too, Mr. Mackenzie. especially when I learned that Charles Carrington had been traveling to Colorado Springs on business around that same time. The crowd turned as one to stare at Carrington, who had gone completely pale. That's a monstrous accusation. I had nothing to do with any stage robbery. I'm not accusing you of robbery, Mr. Carrington, Clara-May said quietly. I'm simply noting another remarkable coincidence. Just as I'm noting the coincidence that you filed your claim on my parents' land the very day after the courthouse fire. The timing was— Carrington's voice cracked. The land was available, and The land was never available, Mr. Carrington. It was stolen. The word hung in the air like a thunderclap. Clara-May looked around the crowd, seeing the dawning understanding on face after face. For 11 years, I've been powerless to speak this truth. A child, then a young woman alone against the most influential families in town. But I've been watching and listening and preparing for this day. She pulled out one final document. This is a statement from Marshal Davies in Colorado Springs, describing the stage robbery and the belongings recovered from Uncle Samuel's body. Among them was a leather portfolio containing legal documents related to the Henderson estate. Judge Ashford had begun to edge toward the back of the platform. This is all very interesting, Miss Henderson, but I fail to see what any of this proves. The fact remains that no will was ever legally filed, no guardianship was ever established, and the property was legally acquired by the town. Legally acquired through fraud, intimidation, and quite possibly murder, Thomas Mackenzie said bluntly. Judge Ashford, I think the people of Dust Hollow deserve to know exactly what happened in those weeks following the Henderson deaths. I've heard enough of these wild fantasies, the judge snapped. This auction will proceed as planned. The girl's documents prove nothing, and her accusations are the desperate imaginings of someone who refuses to accept reality. But his words fell flat. The crowd's mood had shifted dramatically, and Clara-May could see sympathy and outrage replacing skepticism on face after face. Old Henry Parker, a longtime resident, stepped forward from the crowd. Judge, I remember that time. There was talk then about some irregularities, but nobody wanted to speak up against the town fathers. I remember too, added Sarah Mitchell, the schoolteacher. My late husband was working at the bank then, and he came home several times talking about strange transactions and documents that seemed to have gone missing. More voices joined in, people remembering long-buried suspicions and half-forgotten conversations. The careful conspiracy of silence that had protected the guilty for 11 years was finally beginning to crumble. Clara-May felt tears stinging her eyes, but they were tears of relief rather than sorrow. For the first time since her parents' death, she was not alone in seeking justice. The truth has a way of surfacing, she said, her voice carrying clearly over the crowd. It may take 11 years, but it always finds a way. Thunder rolled overhead again, but the storm seemed to be moving past. Through the clouds, Clara-May could see the first hints of sunlight breaking through. The real reckoning was about to begin. The afternoon sun broke through the storm clouds, just as the crowd's murmur grew to a roar of indignation. Clara-May stood on the platform, no longer the ignored seamstress, but the rightful heir demanding justice. The transformation in the townspeople's attitude was remarkable. Faces that had shown indifference or disdain now reflected sympathy and outrage on her behalf. This is preposterous. Judge Ashford's voice cracked as he tried to maintain control. We cannot allow a legal proceeding to be derailed by unsubstantiated accusations and emotional manipulation. Unsubstantiated? Thomas Mackenzie stepped fully onto the platform, his notebook filled with evidence. Your Honor, Miss Henderson has presented documentation that raises serious questions about the legality of the town's claim to this property. As a representative of the press, I believe the public has a right to a full investigation. Charles Carrington pushed through the crowd toward the platform, his face flushed with desperate anger. This is nothing but a scheme to delay the auction. The railroad representatives are here today. If we postpone this sale, we may lose our chance at the railroad depot entirely. "And there it is," Clara-May said quietly, but her voice carried clearly across the crowd. "The real reason for the urgency. Mr. Carrington, you've known about the railroad plans for months, haven't you? That's why you've been so determined to acquire this particular piece of land." Carrington's eyes darted nervously around the crowd. That's simply good business sense. Anyone would try to buy the land legitimately," interrupted a new voice from the crowd. Clara-May was surprised to see Frank Morrison stepping forward, his weathered face set with determination. "Charles, I've kept quiet about this for years, but I can't do it anymore." The crowd fell silent again, sensing another revelation. "My father," Morrison continued, "was the bank president when James Henderson paid those taxes. After James and Martha died, my father was approached by certain members of the town council about irregularities in the Henderson account. He looked directly at Judge Ashford and Mayor Whitmore. They pressured him to alter the records to make it appear that the taxes hadn't been paid. When he refused, they threatened to have the bank's charter revoked for supposed violations." "Frank, you don't know what you're saying." Mayor Whitmore's voice was strained. "I know exactly what I'm saying, Harold. My father told me on his deathbed that he'd been forced to cooperate in a fraud, and it had eaten at his conscience for 20 years. He made me promise to set things right if I ever got the chance." Morrison turned to address the crowd. "The Henderson taxes were paid in full. The records were deliberately altered to make it appear otherwise. And when Samuel Henderson came to town with legal documents that would have exposed the fraud, certain people in positions of power made sure he never got the chance to file them." The accusations hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Clara-May felt her heart racing as the truth she had suspected for years was finally being spoken aloud by others. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, the territory's circuit judge who had arrived that morning on the train, stepped forward from where she had been quietly observing the proceedings. A stern woman in her 50s, she commanded immediate respect. "I've heard enough," she announced in a voice that brooked no argument. "As the senior judicial authority present, I'm ordering an immediate suspension of this auction, pending a full investigation into these allegations." Judge Ashford sputtered in protest. "You have no authority here. This is my jurisdiction." "Actually, Your Honor," Dr. Warren replied coolly, "territorial judges have jurisdiction throughout the territory, particularly in cases involving allegations of judicial corruption, and based on what I've heard today, I have more than sufficient cause to launch a formal inquiry." Charles Carrington made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "This is all madness. You're going to destroy this town's reputation based on the word of a hysterical girl and some questionable documents." The crowd's reaction was immediate and hostile. Angry voices rose from all sides. "That girl has more integrity than you'll ever have. We've seen the documents. They look real enough. What about all those coincidences, Charles? Awful lot of convenient accidents." Clara-May raised her hand for silence, and remarkably the crowd quieted to hear her speak. "Mr. Carrington, I understand your desperation. You've built your plans around stolen land, and now those plans are crumbling. But I want you to understand something. This isn't about revenge. This is about justice." She looked out over the crowd, her voice gaining strength and clarity. "For 11 years, I've lived in this town as less than nothing. I've sewn your clothes, mended your tears, and listened to your conversations. I've watched my family's land sit unused while you debated its future, as if it belonged to you. I've endured your pity, your dismissal, and your condescension." Her voice rose with passion. "But I am not a victim anymore. I am Clara-May Henderson, daughter of James and Martha Henderson, and I will not be silent about the crimes committed against my family." The crowd erupted in applause, and Clara-May felt a surge of emotion that nearly overwhelmed her. For the first time in 11 years, she felt the support of her community. Dr. Warren stepped back onto the platform. "Miss Henderson, I will need to examine all of your documents as part of the official investigation. Are you prepared to turn them over to the territorial court? Yes, Your Honor. I've been preparing for this day for years. And you, Judge Ashford, Doctor. Warren continued, turning to the visibly shaken local judge, will need to provide all records related to the Henderson estate, the property seizure, and any related court proceedings. Many of those records were destroyed in the courthouse fire, Ashford mumbled. How convenient, Dr. Warren replied dryly. Mr. Carrington, I'll also need documentation of your claim to this property and any communications you may have had with town officials regarding its acquisition. Carrington's face had gone ashen. I'll need to consult with my attorney. You do that. In the meantime, I'm placing a judicial hold on any further action regarding the Henderson property. She turned to the railroad representatives. Gentlemen, I assume you'll want to wait for the resolution of these legal questions before proceeding with any negotiations. The lead railroad representative nodded gravely. Absolutely, Your Honor. The Colorado and Southern has no interest in acquiring disputed property. As the crowd began to disperse, people approached Clara-May with words of support and encouragement. Mrs. Rodriguez embraced her warmly, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. Mija, your parents would be so proud, she whispered. You have their courage. Thomas Mackenzie was already planning his newspaper coverage. Miss Henderson, this story will be front-page news across the territory. The truth needs to be told. But it was Frank Morrison's words that touched her most deeply. Clara-May, I should have spoken up years ago. I hope you can forgive an old man's cowardice. She took his weathered hands in hers. There's nothing to forgive, Mr. Morrison. You spoke up when it mattered most. As the sun set over Dust Hollow that evening, Clara-May walked slowly down Main Street toward the general store. But for the first time in 11 years, she wasn't walking as an employee returning to her tiny room above the shop. She was walking as Clara-May Henderson, rightful landowner and respected member of the community. The battle wasn't over. There would be legal proceedings, investigations, and difficult confrontations ahead, but the hardest part was behind her. The truth was finally out, and truth, as her father had always told her, was the foundation of everything worthwhile. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, Clara-May Henderson was no longer alone. The days following Clara-May's dramatic revelation transformed Dust Hollow into a town divided. Word of the confrontation at the auction spread quickly throughout the territory, carried by the railroad representatives, traveling merchants, and Thomas Mackenzie's detailed newspaper account. Within a week, the story had reached Denver and Colorado Springs, bringing unwanted attention to the small frontier community. Clara-May found herself at the center of a social earthquake that split the town along unexpected lines. The morning after the auction, she arrived at Morrison's general store to find a small crowd gathered outside, people who wanted to express their support and share their own memories of suspicious events from years past. Miss Henderson, called out Martha Stevens, the baker's wife, I just wanted you to know that I remember your parents well. They were good people, and what happened to them wasn't right. Similar scenes played out throughout the week. People who had barely acknowledged Clara-May's existence for 11 years now stopped her on the street to offer encouragement. But not everyone was supportive. Elizabeth Carrington swept into the store on Wednesday morning, her face pinched with fury. Clara-May Henderson, she said, making the name sound like a curse. I hope you're satisfied with the chaos you've created in this town. Clara-May looked up from the dress she was mending, her expression calm. I'm satisfied that the truth is finally being heard, Mrs. Carrington. Truth. Elizabeth's voice rose shrilly. You've destroyed the reputation of good men with your wild accusations. My husband has done nothing but work for the betterment of this community. Your husband, Clara-May replied quietly, has profited from stolen land. That's not betterment, Mrs. Carrington, that's theft. The confrontation drew a small crowd of onlookers, and Elizabeth was clearly aware of the audience. "How dare you? Charles Carrington is one of the most respected men in this territory. To suggest that he would be involved in some ridiculous conspiracy—" "Mrs. Carrington," interrupted Dr. E. "Sarah Coleman, who had been shopping for medical supplies, perhaps you should wait for the territorial investigation to conclude before defending your husband quite so vigorously." Elizabeth whirled to face the doctor. "And you? I suppose you support this troublemaker's efforts to destroy our community?" "I support justice," Dr. Coleman replied calmly. "And from what I've seen of Miss Henderson's evidence, justice has been a long time coming." That afternoon, Clara-May received an unexpected visitor. Judge Ashford appeared at the store, looking haggard and years older than he had just a week before. "Miss Henderson," he said quietly, "I'd like to speak with you privately." Clara-May led him to the back room, her heart racing. Was he here to threaten her, to try to make some kind of deal? Instead, the judge slumped into a chair and buried his face in his hands. "You don't know what you've done," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't understand the forces you've set in motion." "I understand that I've exposed the truth about what happened to my family," Clara-May replied, remaining standing. "The truth?" Ashford laughed bitterly. "Yes, you've exposed part of the truth, but there's so much more you don't know, so much more that will destroy innocent people if this investigation continues." Clara-May felt a chill of unease. "What do you mean?" Ashford looked up at her with haunted eyes. "Your Uncle Samuel wasn't just carrying documents about your inheritance, Miss Henderson. He was carrying evidence of other irregularities, other questionable transactions involving territorial land grants." "What kind of irregularities?" "The kind that reach all the way to the territorial capital. The kind that could bring down politicians, judges, businessmen, entire families." Ashford's voice dropped even lower. "Your uncle stumbled onto something much bigger than your parents' estate. That's why he had to be stopped." Clara-May felt the room spinning around her. "Are you saying that Uncle Samuel was murdered to protect a larger conspiracy?" "I'm saying that sometimes the truth is too dangerous to tell, Miss Henderson. Sometimes seeking justice creates more injustice than it prevents." That's not justice," Clara-May said firmly, finding her voice again. "That's cowardice disguised as wisdom." Ashford stood slowly, looking every one of his 60 years. "I was trying to protect you, child. Trying to protect all of us. But you've opened a door that can't be closed now." After he left, Clara-May sat alone in the back room, her mind reeling. Had she unleashed something beyond her ability to control? Were there other innocent people who would be hurt by her quest for justice? That evening, Thomas Mackenzie arrived with news that both thrilled and terrified her. "Clara-May, I've received word from Denver. The territorial governor is sending investigators to look into the allegations of corruption here in Dust Hollow. But there's more. They're also looking into similar irregularities in other communities throughout the territory." "Similar irregularities? Land fraud, document destruction, suspicious deaths of property owners. It appears Dust Hollow isn't the only community where this has happened." Mackenzie's expression was grave. "You may have uncovered something much larger than you realized." Clara-May thought of Judge Ashford's warning. "Thomas, what if pursuing this hurts innocent people? What if there are consequences I haven't considered?" The editor studied her carefully. "Clara-May, 11 years ago, you were a 12-year-old girl who lost everything and had no power to fight back. But you're not that powerless child anymore. You're a grown woman with the evidence and the courage to seek justice for your family." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "There may indeed be consequences. There always are when corruption is exposed. But the alternative is to let injustice continue, to allow other families to suffer what yours suffered." That night, Clara-May walked out to the abandoned Henderson property for the first time in 11 years. The house was gone, torn down years ago, but the foundation stones remained, overgrown with weeds and wild grass. She stood where her family's kitchen had been, remembering her mother's laughter and her father's stories. "I don't know if I'm doing the right thing," she whispered to the empty air, "but I can't stop now. Too many people are counting on the truth." As she turned to leave, she noticed a figure watching her from the tree line. In the moonlight, she couldn't make out who it was, but something about the silhouette made her blood run cold. After a moment, the figure melted back into the shadows, leaving Clara-May with the uncomfortable feeling that she was no longer just seeking justice. She was also being hunted. The next morning brought news that would change everything again. Dr. Warren had arrived from the territorial capital with a full investigative team, and they had made their first arrest. Judge Ashford was in custody, charged with destruction of evidence and conspiracy to defraud. The investigation that Clara-May had started with her simple demand for justice was rapidly becoming something much larger and more dangerous than anyone had imagined. As she watched the judge being led away in chains, Clara-May realized that there was no turning back now. She had started an avalanche of truth that would either bury the corrupt or bury her. Either way, Dust Hollow would never be the same. 6 months after the auction that changed everything, Clara-May stood once again on the foundation stones of her family's home. But this time, she wasn't alone. Workers moved purposefully around the site, framing the walls of a new house built to her specifications. The sound of hammers and saws filled the air where only silence and weeds had reigned for 11 years. The territorial investigation had concluded 3 weeks earlier with results that exceeded even Clara-May's expectations. Judge Ashford had pled guilty to corruption charges and was serving 5 years in the territorial prison. Charles Carrington faced similar charges and had lost not only his ill-gotten land holdings, but also his cattle operation. Mayor Whitmore had resigned in disgrace and left the territory entirely. But the investigation had revealed something even more significant, a network of corruption that extended throughout Colorado Territory, involving fraudulent land seizures, murdered property owners, and systematic theft from families across the frontier. Clara-May's courage in speaking out had opened the floodgates for dozens of other victims to come forward with their own stories. "Miss Henderson," the voice belonged to James Crawford, the foreman of her construction crew. "We're ready to raise the roof beam. Would you like to do the honors?" Clara-May smiled, thinking of how her father would have loved this moment. "I'd be honored." As she helped guide the heavy timber into place, she reflected on how much had changed. The territorial government had not only restored her property, but had also awarded her substantial damages for the years of illegal seizure. The railroad had negotiated fairly for the land they needed, paying her enough to build not just a house, but to establish herself as one of the most prosperous landowners in the region. More importantly, she had discovered that she wasn't alone. The investigation had reunited her with distant relatives she had thought were lost forever. Samuel Henderson's son, Marcus, now a successful attorney in Denver, had traveled to Dust Hollow to meet his long-lost cousin. Through him, she had connected with an entire network of family members who welcomed her with open arms. "Clara-May!" The familiar voice of Thomas Mackenzie drew her attention. The editor approached with a broad smile and a newspaper in his hand. "Have you seen today's edition?" She took the paper, her eyes widening as she read the headline. "Henderson Case Inspires Territory-Wide Reform. Governor Signs Comprehensive Anti-Corruption Legislation." "They're calling it the Henderson Act," Mackenzie explained. "It requires multiple witnesses for property seizures, establishes independent oversight of county courts, and creates penalties for officials who destroy public records." Clara-May felt tears of gratitude stinging her eyes. "My parents would be so proud to know that their suffering helped prevent others from experiencing the same injustice." "Speaking of your parents," Mackenzie continued, "I have something else for you." He handed her a small package wrapped in brown paper. Inside, Clara-May found a daguerreotype photograph. her parents' wedding portrait, which she had thought was lost forever. Where did you find this? In Judge Ashford's personal effects. Apparently, he took it from your house after the funeral, along with several other family items. The investigators returned everything they found. Clara-May traced her fingers over the image of her young parents, their faces bright with hope and love. They had dreamed of building something lasting in Dust Hollow, and despite everything that had happened, their dream was finally coming true. That evening, the new community center hosted a celebration in Clara-May's honor. The building itself was another positive change to come from the investigation. Funded by recovered assets from the corruption cases and designed to serve as a meeting place for all of Dust Hollow's residents, regardless of social class. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, who had stayed in town to oversee the transition to honest government, served as the evening speaker. 6 months ago, she told the assembled crowd, a young woman stood up in this town square and demanded justice. She had every reason to remain silent, to accept the injustice that had been done to her family, to take what little she had and make a quiet life elsewhere. Clara-May, sitting at the head table, felt herself blushing at the attention. Instead, Dr. Warren continued, she chose courage. She chose to speak truth to power, even when that power seemed overwhelming. Her actions have not only restored her own family's honor, but have helped create a more just society for all of us. The applause was thunderous. Clara-May rose to acknowledge it, then raised her hand for quiet. Dr. Warren is very kind, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the room. But I want to be clear about something. I didn't act alone. The moment I spoke up, this community rallied around the truth. People like Frank Morrison found the courage to share what they knew. Thomas Mackenzie used his newspaper to ensure the story was told honestly. Dr. Coleman and Mrs. Rodriguez and Reverend Matthews all stepped forward to support what was right. She paused, looking around the room at faces that had become dear to her. What happened to my family was a tragedy. But what happened afterward, the way this community ultimately chose justice over convenience, truth over comfort, that's something to be proud of. Later that evening, as the celebration wound down, Clara-May found herself standing outside the community center with Marcus Henderson, her newly discovered cousin. I have a proposal for you, he said, his lawyer's training evident in his careful words. My firm in Denver has been retained to handle several more corruption cases throughout the territory, cases very similar to what happened here. You want me to help with the investigations? I want you to consider becoming an advocate for families who have suffered what yours suffered. You have credibility that no attorney or investigator could match. You've walked in their shoes. Clara-May considered the offer. The idea of helping other families reclaim their stolen inheritances appealed to her sense of justice, but she also felt a strong pull toward building a life here in Dust Hollow. Let me think about it, she said finally. I've spent so many years focused on the past. I'd like to spend some time building a future. Marcus nodded understandingly. The offer stands whenever you're ready. As Clara-May walked home that night, to her temporary room above Morrison's store, but soon to her own house on her own land, she reflected on the journey that had brought her here. 11 years of silence and struggle had led to this moment of triumph and possibility. She thought about her parents, about Uncle Samuel, about all the other victims of the corruption that had finally been exposed. Their sacrifices had not been in vain. From their suffering had come a determination to ensure that justice would prevail, that truth would ultimately triumph over power. The next morning, Clara-May woke to find a letter slipped under her door. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the message was clear. Miss Henderson, my name is Rebecca Martinez. My family lost our ranch in similar circumstances to what happened to yours, but in Silverton 3 years ago. I read about your case in the newspaper. Could you help us? We have documents too, but no one will listen. Please write back if you can help. With hope, Rebecca Martinez. Clara-May smiled as she read the letter. Perhaps Marcus was right. Perhaps her true calling was not just to reclaim her own family's legacy, but to help others reclaim theirs. She walked to her writing desk and picked up her pen. There was work to be done, justice to be served, and families to be reunited with their stolen dreams. The seamstress of Dust Hollow had become something more, an advocate for truth, a voice for the voiceless, and a living reminder that courage, persistence, and moral clarity could overcome even the most entrenched corruption. As she began to write her response to Rebecca Martinez, Clara-May Henderson smiled. Her parents would indeed be proud. The truth, as her father had always said, was the foundation of everything worthwhile, and Clara-May had helped build a foundation that would support justice for generations to come. In Dust Hollow and beyond, the age of silent suffering was over. The age of speaking truth to power had begun.